Elizabeth had many problems when she became queen in 1558. First of all, she was a woman. The 1500s was very sexist and misogynistic. People did not trust Elizabeth. They thought she would not be a good ruler because she was a woman. Her sister Mary, Bloody Mary, had just been on the throne, and Mary's reign had had a lot of problems. There'd been food shortages and disease and high taxes and war. So actually, Mary had not been a successful queen. But Elizabeth wants to prove that she can be a successful queen, but people are judging her because she is a woman. Now, linked to that is the problem of marriage. What does she do? People expect her to marry and have an heir, have a child. But she doesn't want to marry because she feels that her husband would take all her power away, because the people in the country would listen to him instead of her because she was a woman. She also wonders who she could marry without it causing problems. For example, she was offered marriage by Prince Eric of Sweden and also Philip II of Spain. But if she'd married the King of Spain, he was a Catholic and she was a Protestant, and she didn't want to marry somebody who was a different religion to her. Religion in general was a huge issue for Elizabeth. She was a Protestant and she became queen when England was Catholic. England had about 3 million people in it, and they did class themselves as Catholics. So she's going to have to try and convert around 3 million people to believe what she believes and become Protestant. Now, that had happened before because her father had made England Protestant and most people had converted. But then her sister Mary had changed the religion back to Catholic. So Elizabeth was having to try and do that again, make everyone change back to being Protestant like her. Linked to that, there was the question of her legitimacy. Elizabeth was legitimate. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was married to King Henry VIII. So she was born as a legitimate heir to the throne. But some Catholics believed that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was not valid because the Pope had not agreed to it. So they claimed Henry and Anne Boleyn were not really married, even though they were. And because of that, they were saying she was born out of wedlock and therefore she's illegitimate. Now, legally, she was legitimate, but there's a group of Catholics who say no, her parents' marriage was not agreed to by the Pope and therefore she's not legitimate. She doesn't have the right to be queen. Now, luckily for Elizabeth, it was only a small number of people who were questioning her right to be the queen, but it was still a problem for her. It wasn't just the Catholics in England that she had to deal with. When she became queen, she was also at war with Catholic France. That was not her fault. Her sister Mary had got England into that war, but she still had to deal with it because England were already fighting France and France were Catholic. Now, at this time, Scotland were also Catholic, and Scotland and France were allies. So Elizabeth was in a really vulnerable position. She was at war with France, and France could potentially attack England across the English Channel, but she also was at risk of being invaded from Scotland because the Scottish were also Catholic. Now, at this time, the Scottish Queen was called Mary, Queen of Scots, but she actually lived in France because she was married to the French heir. So Elizabeth was very vulnerable. She's also losing a lot of money because this war with France was hugely expensive. In the first few months of her reign, she spent £100,000 on this war. And actually, Elizabeth was £300,000 in debt. And at that time, it was a huge amount of money to be £300,000 in debt. So Elizabeth had to try and solve some of her problems. In terms of marriage, she chose to remain unmarried. That way, she would not have to give up any of her power to her husband. It meant she never had a child, but she was happy with her decision. In terms of her being a woman, and therefore not as trusted and not as respected, she chose to counter that by being a strong queen. She was strong in terms of her religious beliefs and forcing people to follow her religion. She was strong in terms of getting England out of debt. She was strong in terms of her foreign policy and her dealings with other countries, such as Spain. So throughout the other revision videos, I will give you examples of her kind of overcoming this prejudice against her because she was a woman, because she stood up for herself and she remained a strong queen. In terms of her religious problems, she also fixed those by bringing in a new Protestant church, but one that did have Catholic traditions within it. And that's why it became known as the Middle Way. It was Elizabeth bringing in her religion, which was Protestantism, but trying to make some kind of compromise and please the Catholics by keeping some of their traditions. And that's why it's called the Middle Way, because it's somewhere in between the two different religions. I'll talk to you more about that in a moment. She dealt with the war she was in with France by making peace. She didn't want to continue that war. England were losing and she was losing too much money. So she quickly made a treaty with the French. It did mean that England lost some land, an area called Calais. Now that is in France, but England had controlled it for hundreds of years. They lost it when Elizabeth made peace with France. But it was still the right decision because they were losing that war and she was losing too much money. She also helped her debt, not just by ending that war, but by selling a lot of land. The crown, the monarchy, owned huge amounts of land in England, and Elizabeth sold quite a lot of it to make money. She also did other things, like she massively cut her own spending, so she tried to live quite cheaply. Obviously, she wasn't living like a peasant, but for a queen, she was trying to cut her expenses. She also made sure that anyone who owed any money to the crown had to pay any of their debts. But her main way of getting extra money was to sell land. And she actually went from £300,000 in debt to £300,000 in the treasury. So she had that money spare for any problems that she might have. She does end up having problems because she ends up having to spend later that £300,000 on war against Spain. But that's not until the 1580s. Actually, she does a really good job of fixing her early financial problems. In 1559, Elizabeth legally changed the religion in England from Catholic to Protestant. And that process is called the religious settlement. It is also sometimes referred to as Elizabeth's Middle Way, because she brought in a Protestant church, but it had some Catholic traditions within it. So she was trying to please the Catholics in England. And actually, there was about 3 million people in England at this time, and the vast majority of them accepted the new Protestant church and became Protestants. The main parts of the religious settlement were the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. The Act of Supremacy changed the head of the church from the Pope to Elizabeth. So the Pope was no longer head of the church as he had been under the Catholic religion. Elizabeth was now head of the Church of England, and her title was Supreme Governor. She also brought in a rule that any member of Parliament or anyone who was a member of the clergy, and the clergy are people who work in the churches, they both had to swear an oath of loyalty to Elizabeth and to swear that they accepted her religion and they accepted that she was the supreme governor. So that was one part of the religious settlement, was getting her MPs and her clergy to swear that she was the head of the church. One of the other important parts of the religious settlement was the Act of Uniformity. This basically said how the religion was going to work, what was going to happen in the churches. And it was about bringing in a Protestant religion, but still having some Catholic traditions, to try and please everybody and to try and make it easier for the Catholics to become Protestant. So the Bible was in English, because in Catholicism the Bible was in Latin, but in Protestantism the Bible had to be in English. So she made the Bible in English. She also brought in a Protestant prayer book and said that everybody, all of the churches, had to use this Protestant prayer book and not any Catholic prayer books. She removed Catholic Mass. Catholic Mass is a special ceremony that takes place in Catholic churches. Catholics think it is very important to take part in that ceremony in order to get to heaven. But Protestants do not have that ceremony. So she banned Catholic Mass from the churches. However, she is trying to keep some Catholic traditions to make people more accepting of her new religion. She wants to make it seem familiar so that people will happily convert and become Protestants. So she leaves things like stained glass windows and other decoration in the churches, the singing of hymns, vestments, which were decorated outfits that the clergy wore, crucifixes hanging on the walls, bread and wine being offered in the churches. All of those things would have been familiar as Catholic traditions, but she kept them as part of her Protestant church to please people and mean that actually this did work, because almost all of the population accepted this and became Protestant. There was other things Elizabeth did to try and make sure that people were following her new religion. For example, she brought in a 1 shilling per week fine. This was because she wanted to make sure that people felt they had to go to her church, and most people in England couldn't afford a shilling per week. So most people went to her church and accepted her new religion because they couldn't afford a shilling a week. She also had her bishops. The bishops were members of the clergy, but they were higher up, and she gave orders to the bishops, and then she got the bishops to then carry out those orders. So they basically helped her to make sure that all of the churches were following her new rules. Now, Elizabeth knew that she could trust her bishops because she had recently picked them all from Protestants. Under Mary, most of the bishops were obviously Catholic. When Elizabeth brought in the Act of Supremacy and said all members of the clergy had to swear an oath of loyalty to her, actually most of the bishops quit. Most of the clergy accepted the oath and went, yeah, that's fine, we accept it. There was about 9,000 members of the clergy, and most of them took the oath and kept their jobs. But we have around 200, mainly bishops, who refused to take the oath of loyalty and therefore were removed from the church. That had put Elizabeth in a difficult position because she didn't have any bishops left. But she just elected new bishops. That means she promoted people. She promoted people who'd just been regular clergy. She turned them into bishops, and she knew she could trust them because they had taken the oath of loyalty to her. So she knew she could trust her bishops, and they helped her to make sure all of the other clergy were doing what they were told and make sure all the churches were doing as they were told. One of the ways the bishops did this was through the visitations. This is when the bishops would visit the local churches and check that they were doing what they were told, using the English Bible, using the Protestant prayer book, not carrying out Catholic Mass, but singing hymns, wearing the vestments, keeping the decoration. So the visitations were exactly what the name suggests. They were visits carried out by the bishops to check that the clergy were doing what they were told and that all the churches were doing what they were told. Now, the visitations were very successful. The first visitations, about 400 members of the clergy were fired because they were found to not be doing what they were told. So then Elizabeth had to find other people to fill their jobs. But as the years went by, very few people lost their jobs. The visitations found that people were following the rules. The other thing that she did to make sure people were following the rules was give the clergy a license. So you couldn't work in a church unless you had a special license. This meant that if someone was found to be going against Elizabeth's rules, she could take their license away and automatically they wouldn't be allowed to work in a church. As a whole, the religious settlement was very successful. It turned England from Catholic to Protestant, and the vast majority of the 3 million people in England did become Protestant. And the vast majority of the clergy, the people who worked in the churches, also transferred to being Protestant. Now, Elizabeth did have some problems with people who decided they wanted to remain Catholic. So I've already explained to you that a lot of the bishops refused to convert to Protestantism and therefore they had to quit their jobs. So there was people who wouldn't convert. Most people did, so most people who were Catholic in 1558 became Protestant. But the people who insisted on remaining Catholic couldn't work in Elizabeth's church, so they lost their job. And the members of the public who insisted on remaining Catholic, they became known as recusants. A recusant was somebody who refused to go to Elizabeth's Church of England. This was actually a very small number of the wider population because most people couldn't afford to be a recusant. They couldn't afford to pay the 1 shilling per week fine. So most people, it's just a small number of Catholics. But among the nobility, who are the rich people in England, about a third of them were recusants. So about a third of the rich landowners in England refused to go to Elizabeth's church. So that's quite a big number of people. And that shows that there was quite a lot of opposition to Elizabeth's church from the upper classes. Not from the rest of the country, but from the upper classes. However, during this early period, between about 58 and 68, the Catholics did not try and be violent to Elizabeth. All of the plots to try and kill her and the rebellions against her came later. At this time, the only thing the Catholics were really doing wrong was they were refusing to go to her church, and therefore they were having to pay a fine. They were also holding Catholic Mass at home because they obviously wanted to do Catholic Mass. It was part of their important Catholic beliefs. So the Catholics held secretly at home, and again, this is usually just the rich people, this is just the nobility, but they held Catholic Mass in secret in their houses. Elizabeth kind of did know that that was going on, but she chose to just kind of ignore it and turn a blind eye. She didn't want to have to keep arresting people for having secret Catholic Mass at home. So as long as people were not being violent towards her, and as long as there wasn't any kind of uprisings or rebellions, she sort of ignored the fact that the Catholics were doing this. Now, as I've said to you, the Catholics in general, most of people who had been Catholic in 1558 did convert. They converted because Elizabeth has included lots of Catholic traditions within the church. So she'd kept things like stained glass, she'd kept decorated outfits, she had kept bread and wine at the church. So there was lots of things about the church that most Catholics went, oh, okay, yeah, I can accept this. I can convert to be a Protestant. But the recusants, the people who refused to convert, couldn't get over certain things. So, for example, they couldn't accept that the Bible was in English. They couldn't accept that there was no Catholic Mass ceremony at the church. They couldn't accept that the Pope was no longer the head of their religion. So those are the people who couldn't accept what she'd changed. They are the people who continued to be a Catholic and had to pay the fines. Most of the Catholics in England just went, okay, she's compromised with us, we will turn Protestant for her. But the key point is that the first decade of Elizabeth's reign, the first 10 years, there was no violence or uprisings from the Catholics. They were quite quiet about what they were doing. The Puritans were another group of people who caused Elizabeth problems during her first 10 years as Queen. The Puritans were not a separate religious group, they were Protestants, but they were an extreme type of Protestant who believed the church needed to be purified of any Catholic traditions. So they didn't like the Catholic traditions that still remained within the church. They don't like all the decoration. They don't like the fact there is crucifixes on the walls. They don't like the fact that the clergy wear special decorated outfits. They see all of that as too Catholic, and the Puritans don't want any Catholic features in the church. The Puritans are happy about quite a bit of what Elizabeth does bring in. For example, they like the fact the Bible is in English. They like the fact the Pope is no longer the head of the church. They like the fact that there is no Catholic Mass and that has been removed. So they do like a lot of the Protestant parts of the church, but they just want to make changes to the church as well. Now, Elizabeth gets quite a lot of pressure on her from the Puritans because lots of members of Parliament are Puritan. A lot of her bishops are, the new ones that she has promoted because the Catholic ones quit their jobs. So when she selected her new bishops, actually a lot of them were Puritan. And actually a lot of members of the regular clergy, the people who work in the churches, are also Puritan. So they support her Protestant church, but they try to pressure her into making changes to make it more Protestant and remove any of the Catholic traditions. Now, the Puritans are not violent. They don't take part in any uprising or plots or violence towards her, but they do put a lot of pressure on her to make changes. One of the key examples of that is the crucifix controversy. The bishops, the ones she's newly picked, threaten that they will quit if Elizabeth does not remove the crucifixes from the churches. Now, a crucifix is a cross that has the body of Jesus on it. So they were usually made of wood or metal, but that's what they were, a cross with Jesus's body on it. And the Puritans said that was a Catholic tradition and it was too much like the Catholic Church. And they said to Elizabeth, if you don't remove the crucifixes from the churches, we will quit. Now, Elizabeth could not afford for the bishops to quit because she'd only just promoted them. Her first lot of bishops had quit already because they were Catholics and they wouldn't become Protestant. She can't afford for her new bishops to also quit. So therefore she has to give in to them and she has to remove the crucifixes from all the churches. She does keep one in her own personal chapel, however. The vestment controversy is also where the Puritans were trying to pressure Elizabeth into doing something. The Puritans thought that the clergy should not wear a decorated outfit. They thought they should wear plain black outfit. Again, that was because the vestments, the decorated outfit, was a Catholic tradition and the Puritans wanted everything to be more simple and focused on God and not focused on decoration. And therefore the Puritans, because actually the Puritans believe in kind of just reading the Bible and praying and focusing on God and prayer, not focusing on all this decoration and things like that. So the Puritans tried to pressure Elizabeth into getting rid of the vestments, and this is the vestment controversy. They tried to pressure her into changing the outfits to plain black. But this time Elizabeth stuck up to them. She wouldn't do it. She forced them to wear the vestments. She sent round strict instructions of what they needed to wear. She even held a fashion show in England, in London, should I say, to show all of the clergy what they had to wear. And she said that that they wouldn't wear the outfits they were told to, the decorated ones, then they would be fired. 37 Puritans lost their jobs because they were continuing to wear plain black instead of what they were told. So the crucifix controversy, she has to give in, she has to let the Puritans win. But the vestment controversy, she stands up to them and they have to back down or lose their jobs. She forces them to wear what she wants them to wear.